This is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Haralambous.
Coming up on this week's programme, we talk at length to a co-ordinator for Medecins Sans Frontieres, who, having just returned from Gaza, tells us what it's like there at the moment.
You can't run the generators, you don't have electricity, every little thing becomes very complicated. I'll give you an example. One of our initiatives was to support a maternity hospital, one of the main maternity hospitals of Rafah. Because, of course, maternity is a big issue now. A cesarean section that needs to stay in for monitoring leaves after 3 hours after the C-section is done. This is very risky for the mother. So we are extending beds in that hospital, and as we are trying to find spaces and also put beds in, we realized that we were lacking blankets, something as simple as that. It took me a day going from place to place and talking from shop to shop, from actor to actor, to find the blankets that I needed for the patients. Blankets. Something as simple as that. Nothing is simple in Gaza.
Well, it's good to be back with you in the new year, but I'm afraid the first topic we're going to talk about is the ongoing carnage in Gaza. Joining us on this week's programme is Nicholas Papachrysostomu. He came back just before Christmas from Gaza, where he's one of the coordinators for Doctors Without Borders, or Medecins Sans Frontieres. So, Nicholas, you probably are the only person at the moment in Cyprus that we could say has been there, has seen what is happening and what doesn't seem to be stopping. I asked you to join me because I want your impressions of what it was like working there. You're not yourself a medical doctor, you do the coordination, I believe. So perhaps you just start by explaining what the coordinating job entails.
Right. Let me first thank you, Rosie, for the interest and say hello to everybody who's listening. So, yes, I've been with the Doctors Without Borders, Medecins Sans Frontieres, for the last however many years, working in emergencies. By this, we mean that the first team that is sent in a situation such as the one in Gaza is the one that I coordinate, meaning that I negotiate the access with the various actors, depending on the situation and who's involved, non-governmental groups, armed groups, governments, whatever it takes, to ensure that, first of all, we have a way in. And then management of security for the teams, the strategic design of our intervention. So is it going to be hospitals? Is it going to be health centers? How do we refer patients from one to the other? What do we need in terms of logistics, vehicles, bases, in terms of human resources? Are we going to need specialists, surgeons, as the case of Gaza would, of course, entail? All of that, the management of the resources, is under my responsibility.
So when you're looking at putting a team together, you mentioned that you will need surgeons, or you might need people who are used to dealing with brain trauma, or whatever it happens to be. What's the pool of doctors and experts you can call upon? And I presume there is a limit to how many are allowed to be in each team.
Yeah, it will be a case-by-case strategy or strategic plan. Medecins Sans Frontieres is a big organization, so as you very correctly identified, we have pools that are on standby because of our work. So we have missions everywhere in the world, and as a consequence, we have also personnel from different countries. Teams are mixed, they're international as well as national teams, local staff as well as international staff like myself, and the particular characteristics of the intervention will determine the teams. For example, a natural disaster and the typology of trauma, an earthquake. Let's take, for example, the big earthquake in Haiti. So that was more orthopedic work there, obviously, because of the circumstances. And then you have an active ground battle conflict, which means that a lot of gunshot wounds. And in Gaza, you would have heavy artillery, you would have tanks, you would have the bombings, you would have burns. So this determines the composition of the teams.
So let's talk about the team that went with you in December. Where did the doctors come from? How did you put them together? How did you get in the first place?
So Gaza is a particular situation. I mean, Medecins Sans Frontieres have been in Gaza since 1989. So this is not new for us. This is a context that we know very well. We've been around, not myself, but the organization. So when this happened, first of all, given the extreme circumstances in the initial evolution, rapid evolution, deterioration, shall we say, of the context, we evacuated the team that was inside. Okay, so I mean, we tried to evacuate. It took us weeks, and as well as this is the exact same thing that other organizations did as well. And we said, okay, let us take the team out and then put fresh people in so they can deal with this. So the intention was never to leave Gaza, obviously, and we will be there for as long as it takes. The negotiations have been difficult, and they are always. So, of course, as we all know, the only way into Gaza now is Rafah. So it's the frontier crossing between Egypt and Gaza, and so we had to obviously negotiate this with Egypt, because as we all know, the Sinai is not a place that allows the Sinai Desert, does not allow free access, right? So that's one, the Egyptian side. Then, of course, the Israeli side, that for reasons of security, they are checking in both aid as well as who comes in. And of course, Hamas, who is the body that controls Gaza, right? So all of this together, and then you hope for the best. A lot of suspicion, a lot of difficult conversations, but I mean, this takes place at various levels, and eventually we ended up succeeding in getting in 13 international staff on the 14th of November.
And tell me where they went first of all, because the other thing, of course, is that as the battlefield, as it were, has moved, I think so have many of your volunteers had to move.
Right. So the teams broke. Let's just be very clear that MSF was not able to run operations after the 7th of October. Different thing if individual doctors, our colleagues, decided to work in that hospital or this hospital, but as coherent teams, we stopped. When the 13 strong member team went in, we tried to regroup. We found our colleagues little by little, and we stuck to the south, because at the time there was no access, and still there's no access to the north. So we went to the city of Khan Yunis, which is the biggest city in the south, right north of Rafah, which is a smaller city, and we began supporting the main hospital, Al Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis, as well as right by the first week we managed to negotiate access to two healthcare centers, two clinics, day center clinics, and that's where we began with primary care, so care of trauma wounds, mental health, sexual and reproductive health, general medicine, obviously, because naturally we have all the bombing wounds and all of the trauma that is a direct consequence, but of course we also have every other ailment that continues to be, including sexual and reproductive. Births continue, pregnant women are at risk because they have to walk, they displace, and all of that. So you have to combine all this, and then at the hospital we did surgical and anesthesiology and surgical support.
anesthesiology if you had the anaesthetics. Now, we heard terrible stories, certainly several months ago, about surgeons having to carry out operations without any anaesthetic. So I want to ask you about that, but I also want to ask you about how difficult is it to get medications and essential supplies for doctors into the strip?
Yes. That's the other problem, right? So one is to get us into the strip, as in humanitarian personnel, but the other is to step up the rhythm with which the humanitarian aid in terms of medicine, in terms of food, in terms of medical equipment, in terms of water, in terms of blankets, in terms of mattresses, in terms of
pretty well anything,
everything,
because
in terms
if
of,
your house has been destroyed, you have nothing, do you?
Well, material, I mean, okay, and then you have to prioritize all this, because some things are essential and they're needed yesterday. Other things, I mean, if you don't get them today and you get them in 2 days, might be better. Water and sanitation.
Is that something that you coordinate, or is somebody else coordinating with you to do the paperwork while you're coordinating your team of doctors?
Oh, no, we have different support teams. I mean, the machines that need to be available and ready in order to do this are immense. This is why very few actors are now active in Gaza. It's the UN, the Red Cross, Medecins Sans Frontieres, and then the rest of the NGOs are still trying, and it's very difficult for them because there's no base. Right? There's no base of support, like the passage, the crossing is not open. So you can't get even if you have the material ready, even if you have it packed, the machine to get it through into Egypt, then put it in trucks, get it through the Sinai. And naturally, I mean, negotiating flights is out of the question, right? And then from there into Rafah. And then hand it over, because you can't, I mean, the trucks that go in, they have to stop. They have to hand over the material to the trucks that receive it. So the Egyptian Red Cross, the Palestinian Red Cross, all of this machine is very, very complex. Right now, out of all this, when I was in, we used to get about 150 trucks in on a good day. On a good day. Let me just clarify that. Before this war began, there were 500, almost 450 to 500 trucks coming into Gaza to deal with the state of Gaza, chronically speaking. No war involved. Being a besieged zone, a controlled zone, they needed this. Now we get 1/5 of that, approximately, a little more. I'll let you guys do the math as to whether this is anything but just a droplet in an ocean of need.
Must be very depressing for the doctors and people like yourself who've gone in to try and do your best, and you're prevented from doing the job you want to do because of other people's agendas, let's call it.
I mean, this is one of the most difficult humanitarian crises I've ever been to, and the frustration is immense because there's so much that you see on the ground, okay, and the situation deteriorates by the day. So the houses that you saw in your neighborhood yesterday are by, I don't know, 10 fewer today because of the bombings. And then you know that the tents are springing up everywhere in the city of Rafah, that is now hosting a ridiculous amount of maybe 1.5 million, some people say, refugees, a city of 300,000, 200,000, I would say, to be realistic, before all this, right? So you can imagine the populational density, okay, in a city that was, in a place that was characterized as one of the most densely populated areas in the world anyway, right? And suddenly you have to deal with this. And with what? With 100 trucks coming in. There is no fuel. There is no possibility to cook bread. You see lineups of 25, 30 people and like 3 pitas on the stove, the makeshift stove with wood fire. You see the trees of your neighborhood. This is things that I've seen in our neighborhood. We opened the clinic in a neighborhood, right? Then 3 days later, the place was full with tents. It was the famous displacement from Khan Yunis into Rafah. We saw this happening. The city was breathing in and out tents. The trees were being cut in front of our very eyes because people didn't have any other resource. There was no fuel at the time. Now there's a little more. Okay, you can't run the generators. You don't have electricity. Every little thing becomes very complicated. I'll give you an example. One of our initiatives was to support a maternity hospital, one of the main maternity hospitals of Rafah, because of course maternity is a big issue now. A cesarean section that needs to stay in for monitoring leaves after 3 hours after the C-section is done. This is very risky for the mother. So we are extending beds in that hospital, and as we are trying to find spaces and also put beds in, we realized that we were lacking blankets, something as simple as that. It took me a day going from place to place and talking from shop to shop, from actor to actor, to find the blankets that I needed for the patients. Blankets. Something as simple as that. Nothing is simple in Gaza.
And let's talk about hygiene, because I'm sure that a lot of the blankets you found after they'd been used were probably desperately in need of a sterilising wash, and I'm sure that didn't happen, and I don't suppose it could do. Nobody's blaming anybody. But what about the more general issues of hygiene in these tented camps? We've seen the rain pouring down, gullies of water, dirty water. Where are people going to the toilet? Can you enlighten us on any of that? Because it's a disaster. Well, it already is a disaster, but it's another disaster waiting to happen, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, washing blankets is a luxury. Let's just forget about that. Enlighten you, this is one of the darkest sides, so I don't think I can enlighten. What I can tell you is that in the clinic that we have reopened, I just found out that since I've left, we were seeing 300 patients a day. Now we're seeing 500 patients a day.
How do the doctors manage?
I don't even know how we manage. I was about to tell you. I'm not so sure that I know how we manage. Our doctors are displaced people. They themselves live in some other apartment that they found somewhere, or our colleagues live in school shelters, with a family around them. We had colleagues living in tents. So if the microcosm of our staff reflects every possible scenario, you can imagine how the displaced people that do not have jobs, because our staff are the lucky people, right, are making ends meet. Now, 1 in 2 patients in our clinic, in one of our clinics, suffers from acute respiratory infection. Very normal. It's cold, it's rainy, and you live in tents. So obviously, if your blanket, if you're lucky and you have one, is wet, then you can't dry it out. As simple as that. So, of course, you will eventually develop an infection. Diarrheas, especially in the children, population of children, are a daily phenomenon. We see a lot of them. More than 3 in 10. It was 3 to 4 in 10 when I was there, right? And of course it's going to be like that because, as you said before, where do you go for toilet? If you're lucky and you live in a school, okay, like an elementary school. We know elementary schools in Cyprus. They are the same, I assure you. There's no difference. You had 10 toilets? Okay. If I tell you that I've seen classrooms clustered with about 90 to 100 people, and you multiply the number of classrooms, you'll arrive to numbers that are in the realm of the imaginary. You have 6,000 people in a school.
And they're living in there. That's the difference, isn't it? They're not just there for morning classes.
No,
they're living there.
I mean, no. This is where they sleep.
So they need to use the toilets several times a day.
So 6,000 over 10, again, the math speaks for itself. If you have these this overcrowding conditions, then of course you're going to get diarrhea. And my fear is not the diarrhea that I see now. My fear is whether at some point, if nothing changes, this would develop into a cholera. Because if it does, God help us all. Okay, so that's one. Second thing, are people hungry? Let's talk about that. I have not seen malnutrition. I want to be very clear, and I'm not an alarmist here. We have not seen malnutrition. We're monitoring daily for it. Okay? But the people are very hungry. So if you're hungry over a period of time, then it does become malnutrition.
It's also very dangerous for growing kids, isn't
absolutely. This is where it's going to show. It's going to show in the population of children. It's going to show in the population of vulnerable people, elderly. It's going to show for the pregnant women that need nutritional food. So if we don't get aid in, then I'm afraid that the social norms that are already breaking will actually crumble. And by that I mean the following. And I will relate an incident. So one of our trucks comes in and we have food, knowing that this is risky. We have food that we want to distribute and medicine. People monitor the trucks because they come in few and far between. So they monitor the trucks, they see the truck. The trucks are platforms, they're open, most of them. Okay, that's what we find. They are open trucks. People jump on the trucks, slash the canvas, and begin throwing things out for the rest of the people to grab. Our own truck arrived at the base, and by that time, it was already a known fact. People had begun gathering. We tried to reason with them. A mob had formed, and they told us, we're taking it. Amidst havoc, aggressiveness, and a lot of violent behavior, the truck was emptied in 15 minutes. Tons. 6 tons of food, right? 7 tons of food. So it's incredible what happens. So what does that tell me? It tells me that the people are very hungry. Nobody does this.
Unless they're desperate.
Unless they're desperate. So what I'm afraid of is that if we don't realize that what we need is for the two parties to immediately agree on a durable ceasefire, things will deteriorate. Okay? And the two parties need to agree on a ceasefire. Both parties have committed atrocious crimes. But for me, right now, what's important is that you need to agree on this. The Israeli authorities have to stop ordering more evacuations. This is a complete violation of international law. People have to be led back to where their remnants of their houses are. Okay, because we have no more space. Rafah will burst at the seam, if it hasn't even, at the seams. We need to stop battling and attacking the medical mission and the humanitarian mission. The doctors need to be let alone. They need to work on what they have to do. They need to work on the many patients that are pending, that are waiting. And of course, the only way to stop the number of the toll of death and injured is to actually stop the hostilities. And aid has to come in volume.
You don't sound as if you feel very confident that that's going to happen. We're going to have to wrap this up very shortly. But
yes.
Just tell me what you think will come next.
I cannot say what will come next, but I can tell you that it has been quite heartbreaking and disappointing seeing that, as I said before, the parties should agree, but the international community should provide the base for this agreement, and we're not. What I see is an international community that's watching the war on TV. That's pretty much what's happening, or on the social media. So for me, what has been disheartening is that with all our might and organization, the UN mechanism, the Security Council, all the power in the world, we are not able to stop what's happening in Gaza. And what's happening in Gaza is pretty much reaching the dimensions of a biblical catastrophe. And we need to realize that. And I think anyone with influence should, any leader with influence, and I'm not referring to strictly the US or the UK or France or whatever, the Arab League. Anyone should speak out so that this stops now.
That was Nicholas Papachrisostomou, who came back from Gaza. He works with Medecins Sans Frontieres, that's the Doctors Without Borders, and he was there in late November, early December, returning to Cyprus just before Christmas.
Keep up to date with events in Cyprus and around the world with the Cyprus News Digest.
This is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Haralambous.
The biggest achievement of Crime Stoppers has been the ability of the public to be able to give information about crime anonymously.
There's no way I could have kept prostituting without the drugs. There's no way I could have had my body used like a public toilet, because that's actually what prostitution is.
And then the fourth series I started 3 days after I'd won the Oscar, so the whole of the Monarch of the Glen experience was all interplatted with the Gosford Park Oscar experience.
I was working with Ronnie James Dio, and David was going to reform Whitesnake in 2003.
Cyprus was chosen because Cyprus is a stable, peaceful and secure place.
We have to really look closely. What are we doing with children? What are we doing with adolescents? And what are we doing with adults that can help them move into a more literate situation?
The ones that I'm proudest of are the ones that were true discoveries, where we found something we didn't know existed.
In other news this week, municipalities in the Nicosia district, that is the municipalities of Aglanja, Aiostometios, Engomi, Lakatamia, Nicosia and Strovolos, have agreed that they must do something about e-scooters being abandoned in public places. Apparently, very often they block the pavements, making life very difficult for pedestrians and disabled people. And so they've sent a letter out to the companies that rent out scooters to say that they must better control their fleet of hired vehicles. Now, let's be clear, this doesn't apply to privately owned scooters. Presumably you don't leave those just abandoned on a pavement somewhere. But from now on, those who hire out scooters will have to have stations where they can be left after their use, and any that are found abandoned may well be confiscated with a fine imposed to get them back again. And in other traffic news, mobile traffic cameras are now going to be able to catch drivers speeding on both sides of the road. You perhaps have noticed recently that the traffic cam vans have appeared on one side of the road while the warning sign is placed on the opposite side. Well, according to the traffic police, that's because the speed control is now done on cars travelling in both directions. Well, that about wraps up this edition of the Cyprus News Digest. Many thanks for your company. Hope you'll join me next week. Till we meet again, take care and God bless. Bye-bye now.